Let me just open the paper. So this is just to say that this version that I'm going to read is edited for the sake of not speaking too long during the session, taking up. But the full version is available on the UCL Anthropocene website. But I'm going to indicate when a section has been cut and just summarize its content very briefly. So am I okay to start? Okay. We'll be discussing the variability of animals, not between species whose differences have long been noted, accepted, and observed, but within a species, between individuals and groups, which has long been minimized, neglected, or even denied. These are not regular variations, such as the alternation of days and nights or seasons, but variations resulting from adaptation to original particular circumstances or contexts, adjustments of an individual, social, or specific type, of greater or lesser intensity, of more or less widespread distribution, of greater or lesser duration. Although the behavioural plasticity of many species is now accepted, little thought is given to its extent and scope over time, with the past often being confused with the present and old situations being equated with present ones, which are taken as benchmarks. As a result, historical differences are overlooked, minimized, or denied, and we're quick to claim, without proof, that the observers of old were obviously mistaken if they can contradict contemporary knowledge. This is because the main historical studies show that behavioral flexibility is strongly exerted over time, and that the behavior of a species, its groups, and its individuals undergo multiple adjustments in relation to various factors. These adjustments lead to modifications, which constitute singularities that are variations around the potential of each species, or to innovations whose scale and complexity prevent any reduction of them to mere random fluctuations feeding natural selection. This, however, is still the instinctive reading of many eco-ethologists who seek coherence with the interpretation from evolution. In fact, behavioral variations create individualities, sociabilities, and particular cultures, which are more or less durable in space, but also in time. These variations create a history and a geography of behavior, with parallel and successive periods, clusters, and cultures, independent of or bound up with environmental and human situations, which themselves vary in time and space. Behaviorist ethologists and ecologists increasingly emphasize the cultures, sociabilities, and individualities distributed throughout today's world. But they are too quick to forget that the animals they're observing come from another epoch and are even often happy to limit themselves to Western animals in environments, including human ones, that we know were not the same in the past. Ethologists play down the fact that what they observe are therefore often states of a moment, of an era, some of which did not exist before. First, let's look at the reasons for the long-standing neglect or even refusal of the behavioral variations of a species so that we can understand where we're coming from, Westerners at the beginning of the 20th century, scientists and citizens, and what we need to change in our minds and therefore in our questioning, our approaches, our observations, and our readings. Because it really is a question of how we look at things, in fact, of representations forged long ago, handed down across the ages, feeding a Western culture that's not total, but which is dominant. The aim here is not to give a history of conceptions from antiquity to the present day, but simply to highlight a few milestones, above all, among naturalists. Let's start with ancient Greece, which played a fundamental role because some of these conceptions were adopted by the Romans and then by a dominant Christianity and passed down through it to Western zoology and philosophy. These Greeks associated species more with space than time. They did not think in terms of the evolution of species, but rather in terms of variations within a species. They considered the history of species to be a succession of generations produced by Mother Earth before they take on an identical reproduction and therefore stabilize. Aristotle, the primate of naturalists, believed in the identical progression of bodies in each species, in differences in behavioral capacities according to the quality of the soul, and within these degrees, in learning, cunning, and intelligence, but at the individual level, as incessant variations in space without historical consequences. He only sketches out a few ideas about a change in the naturalness of species, making exceptions only of horses and dogs as a result of human action. History, in fact, politics and culture, are reserved for humans who have logos. This view was echoed by the philosophers, even Plutarch, who confirmed the use of reason, learning, and cunning in animals, but reserved this for individual variations of no consequence over time. Although Christianity imposes a linear notion of time that's distinct from divine eternity and conflated with sacred history, creation, fall, redemption, final judgment, this doesn't apply to animals, which were all created, the wild and the domestic, in a perfect manner at the time of Genesis, and are therefore immutable in number and behavior. Spatial and temporal variations in behavior are not unknown. They abound in the lives of the saints, for example, when a wild animal softens and begins to serve. But whether real or fictitious, all this remains individual, temporary, the fruit of the finger of God or of the devil. It was within this cultural framework that the naturalists of the 16th century moved, rediscovering the idea of the creative extravagance of a nature in their reading of ancient texts, a wildly proliferating creation, an unguided, ungoverned free play. These naturalists thus perpetuated a kind of presentification of species, which remained in place until the 18th century, when the scientific revolution took effect. This revolution established the idea of a concrete, natural, and no longer simply sacred linear time, imposed by physics and imported into zoology, notably by Buffon, who drew up a history of the presence of species and their geographical distribution as the Earth evolved, contradicting the biblical idea of an unchanging creation. A veritable history geography of animals was thus created, but between species. Within each species, permanence remains the order of the day on account of instinct, even if Buffon admits individual fluctuations and temporary adaptations to the environment. In the same period, Charles-Georges Leroy was one of the few to mention not only intelligence, but also the perfectibility of animals, which implied a history and a geography of individuals and groups within a species. Leroy spoke out against the idea of instinct, convinced that animals have sensations and a memory, and therefore a knowledge of the past, which forms the basis of an intelligence that's specific to each species. He insisted on individual differences within a species based on intelligence, but above all based on learning and instruction throughout life, and therefore on the experience they acquire as a function of circumstances. So, to understand animals properly, Leroy maintains that we need to follow the entire history of individuals to see how they are driven by needs and passions, how they cope with circumstances, how they're enriched by experience, and how they innovate. He's not far from the notion of the history of individuals and the biography of animals, which genre was born in literature at the same time in England and then in France. Nor is he far from a history of each species when he writes what is taken to be instinctive is perhaps no more than a habit learned long ago, which presupposes a history of adaptations over a long period of time. However, his hierarchical representation of living beings, which was common at the time, compromises the idea of the perfectibility of animals as each species remains assigned to its place. Only humans experience progress, a favorite idea of the Enlightenment, because of capacities deemed superior. The intuition could have been developed with the first ideas of transformism, but it was weakened by the cultural representation of living beings, which translated into philosophical and scientific convictions. Thus, Lamarck wanted to establish the origin and development of species, because nothing is constantly in the same state on the surface of the earth, that's a quote, which led him to reject their permanence. Since transformation comes from ways of living and circumstances, he rejects the identity of behaviors between members of a species, placing the emphasis on individuals and their diversity of attitudes and ways of existing according to circumstances. However, given his confidence in the pyramidal organization of animals, he also asserts that changes in human behavior are widespread, but are limited and slow as we descend to the lower animals, and that it takes several thousand centuries to transform species. He therefore sets aside the history of their attitudes, which cannot be observed over this stretch of time. He focuses on the physical transformation of species and concentrates on a geography between species. In The Origin of Species, Darwin arrived at the idea of a history of the behavior of a species, but he too considered it difficult, if not impossible, to observe. We are so familiar with our domestic animals that we do not see to what extent their mental faculties have been modified, and that in a permanent manner. It is very difficult even to conjecture by what successive degrees many conformations have passed in order to perfect themselves. That's a quote. Hence his insistence on the mechanism of transformation and on clearly visible spatial diversity. This does not prevent him from hoping for, to quote, even more important research on the necessarily gradual acquisition of all mental faculties and aptitudes. In other words, on a history of abilities and behavior in order to understand the origins of man. It's to this end that, in The Descent of Man, he insists on the strong variability of the faculties of the individuals of a species, who thus greatly differ from the point of view of their intellectual faculties. This led him to envisage the possibility of learning among apes or among domesticated animals under human impulse, and of adaptations or one-off inventions, or even to think that, to quote, instinctive actions could lose their fixed and natural character and be replaced by others more complex by free will. But these ideas came up only in passing and only put forward cautiously in order to remain in line with the prevailing cultural credo. Above all, they're limited by the pyramidal representation that is deeply rooted in Darwin, granting only a little intelligence in the superior animals and many instincts, especially in the inferior ones. Darwin touched on the idea of a history of the behavior of a species, but did not explore it, not only because he thought it impossible to do, but because he saw it as linear, with a high degree of stability between each event. The domesticated have been like that since domestication, not thinking of a fluctuating, jagged history in which the expression of behavior varies from one era to the next, or from one group to the next. Darwin's followers fall into this in-between category. But these considerations were swept aside in the 20th century, which preferred structures to dynamics. Behaviorism considers that each animal is configured by an invariant process, stimuli-responses, which, depending on the circumstances, gives rise to particular individuals and behaviors, and therefore to great diversity, but to no trend. Personal development, ontogenesis, is valued, while the history of species, phylogenesis, is neglected. In contrast, the so-called objectivist school of Konrad Lorenz considers that most behaviors are innate, and that they define the species, and that all its individuals are similar in space and time. These adynamic conceptions of time and space are supported by a number of philosophers, notably Martin Heidegger, who believes that only humans can shape the world and therefore have a history and a geography, whereas animals are poor in the world, without logos and self-awareness, and therefore outside time. However, a deconstruction of these postulates began to emerge in the late 1950s, remained very marginal until the 1980s, and then became frequent. Birds were its first object, addressing the individual variability of songs within a species, the existence of dialects and traditions from one group to another, and also monkeys. Specifically, the live observation in Japan from 1953 onwards of a macaque choosing to soak its sweet potatoes in water and gradually passing on this culinary invention to relatives. This constitutes a break in space and time. This was also the undertaking of Jane Goodall, who set out to observe chimpanzees in 1960 and discovered variability in time, space, and time. Individual variability due to differences in personality and capacity, which led her to sketch the history of individuals and then to undertake biographies for her thesis. Variability, too, in groups, which are unstable and therefore fluctuate, with contested hierarchies and forms of social ascension, which lead to an animal sociology that should take us towards a social and political history. Variability also stems from adaptation to a changing environment in different ways for individuals and groups, which would be the subject of animal psychology, sociology, and ethnology. Variability, finally, with the presence of communities that differ in their way of life, with good relations or conflicts between individuals or between communities, which should lead to a political and cultural ethnology, geography, and history. Moreover, Goodall goes so far as to envisage a history of chimpanzees in relation to changes in behavior, such as the scratching of subordinates, which has become a ritual over the centuries, so that today the chimpanzee simply gives a symbolic caress instead of scratching its submissive companion. This behavioral flexibility is at the origin of the notion of culture, put forward by the Japanese as early as 1959 and contested until the 1990s, but which has since been established as a set of perennial behavioral differences between one group of a species and another. At the same time, ethologists have conducted sociological, ethnographic, geographical, and cultural studies of animals, all of which have the spatial dimension in common. This background helps us to understand why the spatial dimension has been rediscovered recently and has become the most extensively studied area. Initially conceptualized by the Greeks, it's often remained present in our Western culture, even if its developments have been minimized or even denied in terms of its implications for animal capacities. No doubt, because it can be integrated into other spatial dimensions, mountain ranges, plants, humans, because it is concrete, easier to see, observe, think about, and evoke for purposes that are not only scientific, but also and just as much literary, moral, religious, and philosophical. In the end, it was only really denied at certain periods, notably the Cartesian 17th century, influential among naturalists, and the behavior objectivist 20th century. The proximity of the latter episodes explains the difficulties in breaking out of this prohibition at the end of the 20th century, and the fact that all the complexities and riches of the spatial have yet to be explored. To understand why, on the other hand, the temporal dimension is still neglected, even forgotten, we must not deny the long-standing difficulty of concretely imagining this time, especially in a linear way, when it seems circular, made up of repeated successions, almost cancelling each other out, while the spatial dimension is more easily concretized by the difference in places. Nor should we deny the real difficulties that naturalists today have in taking time into account, whether in animals or humans. Diane Fossey, despite being a long-term observer, talks about the difficulty of observing over a long period of time because of the fleetingness of animals and the haste of humans. All the more so because expeditions like Goodall's or Fossey's no longer exist, both because they required these researchers to sacrifice part of their careers, even their lives, and because material conditions have deteriorated significantly in many places. The scientific and financial orientations of current research favor short stays with rapid returns, where the spatial is better studied than the temporal. Study conditions should be modified to develop the temporal dimension. However, this oversight is part of a long refusal to take time into account, not just because time is less concrete and harder to grasp. Paying attention to time in animals, accepting change, means granting them a history and the capacities that make it possible, memory, choice, strategy, politics, etc., reserved for humans since at least Aristotle, and even long denied to human populations who have been considered barbaric or primitive and without history until recently. Granting a history is not an innocent gesture, but a philosophical and political one, because of the repercussions it implies. More than the underestimation of space, the denial of time has had considerable effects on human representations of animals, which are considered instinctive, natural, and material, and on the conditions accorded to them. Even when it is considered, time is not perceived as a factor of differentiation in a species, unlike space, which is concretized as a diversity of environments, which are essential factors according to behavioral ecology. Although time is essential for a change to take place, and the spatial dimension cannot unfold without it, it is all too often judged as a simple locus of differentiation, of no interest in itself. Contra this, we need to emphasize two aspects. Through the many changes in environments, physical, plant, human, that it has undergone, time has offered and enabled many behavioral changes now forgotten. It's therefore not a neutral place, but an active space for change, and it's also a real factor in animal adaptations and variations. As we've seen, naturalists have considered this issue, but have abandoned it, either in search of timeless mechanisms like natural selections, or because they were unable to study it properly. This is a problem that paleontology and genetics have corrected for very long periods of time, but which remains in place for the short and medium length periods. So much so that today's ethologists, beginning to take this dimension into account, reserve it for the future, proposing methods of observation over several animal generations to come, thus avoiding having to use historical sources that these ethologists do not master, instead using instruments and protocols that suit them. We therefore need to focus on the spatio-temporal dimensions of animals, i.e. the construction, dissemination, and originality of attitudes, specific, social, or individual, in time and space, the transformations, fluctuations, localizations, and periodizations of these behaviors, as well as the factors involved, because classic evolutionary pressure alone cannot account for them when they occur over short or medium periods of time. In order to work on the temporal dimension, history must be prioritized. It's obviously necessary to look at the influence of animals, at their real role as actors, to better understand our history. But we mustn't stop there. At a time when numerous ethological discoveries are proving the diversity and richness of animal capacities, it's time to take the side of these living beings actors, who deserve to be studied for themselves, in particular to discover their history, more or less related to ours, more or less independent. The first step is to study the lived experiences of animals, i.e. their physiological, psychological, and behavioral ways of feeling and living conditions, circumstances, and events. This, in turn, enables us to better understand their relationships with humans, to reintegrate them into the world, and to better measure the effect of their actions. To do this, We need to take an interest in the animal aspect of things, to cross over to their side. This means trying to put ourselves alongside them in order to adopt their geographical point of view, to understand what they experience and suffer, how they act and react. It also means trying to discover their psychological point of view, what they see and feel. This requires empathy and adaptation. It's not about becoming an animal. That's obviously impossible. It's an intention, an effort of projection, a method. Naturalists have done this, and now ethologists are doing so by affirming the need to focus on the point of view of animals, just as ethnologists have been trying to do for a long time with human populations. The fact that it's impossible to completely exit the human point of view or its civilization, and that access to animals or other humans is limited, is no reason to give up. This effort allows us to take a step back and reveals many aspects that were either unsuspected or neglected, downplayed, or even denied until now. All this means rehabilitating animals who have long been devalued by a Western concept built up during Greco-Roman antiquity, then adopted by the dominant version of Christianity, and then developed by philosophy and science. This is a view that suggests that animals have weak capacities and are highly passive in relation to the world. By contrast, we need to take account of the recent ethological revolution, which proves that animals are beings that feel, experience, react, and adapt, with ethology, the science of animal behavior, also emphasizing, for a growing number of species, their strong cognitive abilities, their personal behaviors, their social skills, and their individual and social cultures. Animals are real actors, living strong relationships with each other, influencing humans and their relationships with them. And once again, for a growing number of species, these are individuals with singular characteristics, persons with their own behaviors, even subjects with their own strategies. Turning our attention to animals requires us to revise the definition of history as the science of human beings in time. This definition was constructed in the first third of the 20th century to broaden the scope of history, to take it out of the realm of events alone, to make it a human science which studies human aspects like any other science. We need to broaden this definition, which is now too restrictive. It needs to be extended to include animals and even other living beings, and thus be defined as a science of living beings over time. This means taking an interest in the history of living beings, in this case animals, at least those for which there are historical sources, enabling historians to practice their profession and contribute their skills. At first sight, it may seem paradoxical to use human documents to trace the events and actions of animals. This is because humans are only interested in certain species, races, and individuals, and in certain aspects of their lives, which even then have only been partially recorded, retaining only what they could and wanted to look at and see, reading and distorting with their imaginations, their interests, and their certainties about a species, a society, an era, and individuals. But these problems apply just as much to human history. Historians have always had to deal with the biased nature of testimonies, have always had to decipher the cultural grids at work, and have often had to work through intermediaries, judges or notaries, for example, for the peasants of the Middle Ages, or men for the women of Greek antiquity, because these humans did not testify. Here, the difficulty is greater, with a leap of species, and not just of ethnicity, social class, or sex, but it is not radically different. Historians need the support of the life sciences in order to read and analyze documents properly, ecology, to assess the influence of environments, physiology, to estimate states, and above all, ethology, to decipher behavior. In practical terms, this involves cross-referencing documentary information with current scientific knowledge or hypotheses, particularly ethological ones. The aim is not to validate or invalidate historical evidence with ethological knowledge, as ethologists may be very tempted to reject or distort historical evidence according to their bias. It's a question of bringing together different points of view and different types of knowledge. Those of humans in the past, who may not have seen this or that aspect, or who may have seen what we can no longer see, or what we don't want to see nowadays, and who may therefore have knowledge that we no longer have. With those of today's ethologists, who may know more and better than they did in the past, but may also ignore, forget, or neglect this or that aspect because they're not experts in those past situations. The most immediate version of history, as seen through the eyes of animals, and the easiest to detect and trace, is that of their involvement in major human historical phenomena. Indeed, many animals, whether domesticated or captured, were involved in a wide range of activities, and there are many documents which mention humans first and foremost, but which also, on the fringes and with varying degrees of relevance, mention these exploited beasts. It's often possible to turn these accounts around, to read them from the animal's point of view, to glimpse how they experience these human phenomena in their flesh and minds, to highlight their adaptations, their resistance, their complicity, their suffering, and to establish how these experiences influence their relationships with humans and the behavior of humans. And Éric gives examples here regarding the lives of agricultural animals from the Neolithic period onwards, and notes that experiences will differ according to different jobs that animals have been forced to do, and how these have changed over time, with some jobs and some forms of life disappearing altogether. Like humans, animals live through historical periods determined by their environment, both ecological and human, or by themselves. It's important to identify, delimit, and characterize these periods to better cross over to these animals' side and better grasp their own histories. This periodization certainly differs from species to species and from place to place, but in some cases, it can already be sketched out. Dogs. They are far from having known the same environment, the same conditions, and the same experiences over time. Most of today's dogs are companion dogs, but for a long time, this type of dog was in the minority until the interwar years, and even absent at times. Companion dogs are nothing like the multi-purpose dogs of the pre-Roman era, who were at once refuse collectors, guardians, hunters, pets, and then butchers' meat and converted into carpets or clothing. Today's dogs are nothing like the errant dogs who populated towns from Roman antiquity right up to the middle of the 20th century, who were tolerated because they were scavengers, living alongside humans but not with them, leading independent lives, often in groups. Versatile dogs in the Gallic world, more numerous, more diversified and specialized dogs in the Roman period, essentially companion dogs since the mid-20th century. It's possible to discern the existence of very different canine eras. But we mustn't think that animals remain the same throughout their eras, always identical, merely undergoing passively a succession of conditions and experiences. In reality, they change in order to adapt, constrained by environmental pressures, human actions like selection, education, and themselves through learning and transmission. These changes can be physical, for both free-living or wild, in inverted commas, animals, and for domesticated animals whose size, weight, gait, and abilities have varied greatly over time, depending on the situation. There's little to compare between the seasonally migratory pig of the Ancien regime, black, small, muscular, and irritable, and its current successor in industrial workshops, light-coloured, tall, obese, and out of breath. And again, Éric offers a rich supply of examples here. Maybe he can talk about them afterwards, of the physical and behavioural transformations of especially cows, dogs, and cats. And he refers, for instance, to a new Western version of the cat, the chat chien, or cat dog, to quote, who has never existed before, close, solicitous, playful, attentive, anxious about separation. This also applies to wild animals, however difficult it is for us to realise. We can see it clearly in contemporary changes that are easier to observe, such as the foxes who have been moving into towns since the 20th century, or the European beavers who are recolonizing rivers, adapting to an increasingly anthropized environment, approaching humans, and even forming relationships with them, and who, within limits, are showing themselves to be more tolerant than in the past. In fact, the necessary adaptation of animals to ecological and human conditions on pain of extinction requires incessant fluctuations over time and space in attitudes and sociability, which needs to be highlighted in order to build a history of behavior, its construction, transmission, and transformation, and its temporal and spatial evolution. Until now, we've thought of animal history at the level of the group, at the level of groups of this or that species. But it also needs to be considered at the level of individuals, especially since many historical sources refer only to individuals, because this is often how humans meet animals. Moreover, most of the major ethological discoveries since the 1950s have been made by focusing on individuals, because individual differences reveal the diversity and richness of abilities and behavior, the complexities of social skills, the adaptations and the inventions, as well as the transmission of conduct, leading to the creation of local cultures. The personal experiences of individual humans have become legitimate in the human sciences in order to understand their experience, their ways of living through an event, a phenomenon, an era, and their reactions, which may have influenced the surrounding context. This must be applied to animals by way of historical biographies, but we must distance ourselves from the anthropomorphism of the literary biography, which has been in vogue since the end of the 18th century, and which attributes human capacities to animals, thereby masking their originality and richness. We must also distance ourselves from the anthropocentrism of the rare biographies of real animals, which often deal only with the humans who surrounded them. For the moment, famous animals, whether domestic or free living, are the most accessible because they've produced a wealth of evidence from which the notion of reconstitution can be mobilized, just as in paleontology, prehistory, and archaeology, where a few remains and clues serve as the basis for reconstructions of humans, gestures, and buildings, reconstructions which are obviously hypothetical, but carefully evaluated and controlled, and hence indispensable if we want to see, understand, and facilitate questioning and research. Obviously, these reconstructions can only be partial, focusing only on the aspects suggested by the documents, and biased, since they are based only on what is currently available in terms of faculties for this or that animal. The aim of these biographies is to give an account of what an individual experiences, goes through, and feels at a given moment or throughout his or her life, and thus arrive at a history embodied in flesh and blood. It's about paying attention to personality, singular experience, relationships with others, transformations over the course of a lifetime, as well as to the representation and placing in the history of the group or species. Individuals embody and therefore render detectable behavioural and cultural differences at a given time, changes from one generation to the next, and animal eras. All these aspects form a history on the side of animals, an animal history with its own dynamics, i.e. its accelerations, its ruptures, its changes, its periods, and its continuities. Animals are no more natural or immutable than humans. They are no more a part of the Earth's scenery than we are, a scenery that, incidentally, is not a scenery at all, but one that also has a history. So-called wild animals are no wilder than wild humans, whom we also want to blend into wild nature. Domesticated animals were not created as they are today, unchanged. They have all changed a great deal, because they all evolve in an unstable environment with which they have to contend, to which they adapt on their own or under external pressure. We therefore need to take an interest in the incessant adjustment of animals to their environmental conditions, ecological and human, and the fluctuation in their gaits, attitudes, and sociability in space and time, so as to build a history of species, their groups, and their individuals, a history of conditions, experience, behavior, and cultures.
Super. Thanks so much, Mariam. That was really clear, really helpful, and
Thank you. Thank you.
and of course, thank you, Eric. And it's a wonderful tour d'horizon of all of your various different ideas. Eric, est-ce que vous voudriez ajouter quelque chose à ce point, ou est-ce qu'on vous préférez que...
Non, je n'ai rien à rajouter. Simplement, je remercie beaucoup Mariam pour son travail de passage en anglais et puis pour sa lecture.
Super. So just thanks to you, Mariam, for that. So we will pass on to our respondents. So first of all, we'll go to Sophie, and then we'll go to Tom. And I think we'll see if there are particular things we want to pick up, or that Eric would like to pick up after each of those interventions. But Sophie, I'll pass over to you first.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully, what's blank? Can everyone see that?
Yep.
Great. Okay, so this was a wonderful paper. Thank you for inviting me to give a response. Eric's paper calls with academic rigor and compassion for historians to take the side of living beings who are also actors, to discover their history more or less related to ours, more or less independent. In my response, I'm going to take up Éric Baratay's challenge to historians to locate the behavioural plasticity of animals in time and apply his thinking to my own area of expertise, which is medieval Europe. So I'm going to start with 3 questions in relation, or comments in relation to the talk, and then move on to medieval examples. My first question is to do with sources, and whether, rather than thinking as we go back in time of more and more limited and fragmented sources, we can think about the value which a given corpus of historical sources can offer to this kind of history of animals. In medieval Europe, philosophers placed limits on animal rationality, like many other periods, but they proposed a variety of emotions that an animal could experience in a physical and cognitive way, such as love, hate, desire, aversion, joy, sadness, fear, hope. This means that from this time and place, we have sources rich in observing and imagining animal emotions, not least because the number of animals, the biodiversity is richer, the numbers are richer, and proximity is different as well. So my first question is about sources. My second comment is about ethology. And I'm wondering what are Eric's favourite case studies, the good practice of historians and ethologists working together. Do historians cite their ethnology sources enough? What works really well? And I'm aware that in ethology, there are currently 5 categories of animal behaviour through which animal personality is explored. These are activity, aggression, exploration, affiliation, and neophobia. And this might be an interesting starting point for thinking about animal behaviour in the past as well. And my third point in question is whether we should keep attention on our current climate and biodiversity crisis by looking at animals that fail to have behavioural flexibility, but also to think about the reduction in scale that we have in the present. I think we're probably all aware that we need to be wary of shifting baseline syndrome. That is our tendency to imagine that environmental conditions at the edge of our own memories represent the way that the world used to be. As historians, we can help people notice the ghosts and what has been lost. So I turn now to medieval Europe. And just some general context for those of you who are not medievalists. medieval European thinkers understood individual variation in animals. On the left, you have the goddess Natura, who crudely, by means of a forge, not only creates individual species, but also every individual within a species, continuously working. And the point here is that every individual will therefore be subtly different. And something else about this variation to note is that after the fall, nature is also corrupted in Christian thinking, and animals now have the power to resist human domination, which they do in varying degrees. So a second point about medieval Europe is about sociability and joy. There's an acknowledgement that every creature has an inborn wish to exist and loves to exist with a natural desire. And this, combined with the idea of emotions in animals, leads to some tentative steps towards thinking about animal sociability, which is one of our 5 categories that ethologists are particularly interested in. And third, in medieval Europe, there is a recognition of individual personalities, or as ethologists put it very carefully, consistent individual behavioural variation. I'm going to give the example of dogs shortly. These are apparent from birth and can also be enhanced by learned behaviours, both an animal teaching itself through repetition or by human training and taming. It's difficult to reconstruct detailed animal biographies for medieval Europe in the very rich way that Éric has done for 19th and 20th century animals. But we can work, I think, with different rich animal perspectives. We have sources imagining a hare lamenting living the life of an animal constantly hunted, a sparrowhawk expressing a fear of death, a human imagining life as a wolf. And here I think we need to work with anthropocentrism, actually, rather than reject it altogether. And some contemporary ethologists are coming to this viewpoint as well. So we can perhaps sketch a few cases of biographies of animals, but these are those in close contact with members of the elite. So we have Isabella d'Este's pet Aura, about whom we have a lot of sources, including poems lamenting her death, and also sources around the pet wolf of Count Robert of Artois. So these are animals very much within elite circles, companion animals, or animals that have had somehow an impact on the society around them. So I'm in my concluding section, I'm going to turn to 3 case studies. It was hard to choose, actually, but I chose dogs, horses, and cats. So thinking with dogs in medieval Europe, and the mutual adaptation of humans and animals and behavioural variability in a group. Gaston Phoebus, the 14th century Count of Troyes and author of the Livre de Chasse, thought that elite hunting dogs should be addressed as friend or brother. Adaptation was from both sides. An apprentice hunter looked after his lord's pack from the age of 7 and lived and slept with the dogs while he also learned the verbal commands, visual signals, and blowing of the horn that were used to train them. A truly good hunter was expected to understand a dog's own language so that their mutual acting, feeling, and thinking could create a close bond and shared purpose. Dogs were trained in ways that suited their sensory umwelt, tracking the praise not of scent trails, for example. And in terms of our history of behavioural plasticity, I wonder if a question for medieval historians might be to think about whether it's in medieval Europe that hunting dogs are trained to understand the human gesture of pointing, which is a faculty dogs share with very few other animals. In groups of hunting dogs, behavioural variability due to different personalities and capacities is valued and noted. These are not always valued and noted. Sources acknowledge that long after the hunting day was over, weary apprentices would be trekking back through forests and villages, calling out for dogs whose personality was over-adventurous or with a tendency to get lost. Both admired and abhorred qualities in dogs are reflected in a list of 1,100 dogs' names in a surviving hunting manual manuscript. You've got some on the right. These include best of all, amiable, jolly boy, nose wise, but also dreadful, sinful, and wretch. But there's 1,090 more for those who are interested in dogs' names. So my question about dogs in medieval Europe is pointing. Foxes. Here I want to think of plasticity of behaviour in relation to new environments. In many parts of medieval Europe, wolves and previously other apex predators like lynxes and bears are becoming extinct because of hunting and deforestation. But red foxes were adapting to human ecosystems and their increasing contact with humans. In modern ethological terminology, foxes, as well as cats and dogs, are part of the order Carnivora, who as a species and also particular individuals possess three important attributes for success in human environments. Neophilia, that is a willingness to be interested in new things, boldness and behavioural flexibility. As well as targeting previous prey species like rodents, rabbits and hares, actually rabbits are quite new, medieval foxes broke into farmyards and stole chickens, duck and geese, as illustrated on the right. This is a very common medieval illustration depicting it fleeing from a woman carrying a distaff. This is a staff for wool. The movement between wild and human worlds is reflected in the very popular literary character of Reynard the Fox, who is alternately depicted with vulpine realism and as a very anthropomorphic trickster. Moreover, reflecting fortunes, Reynard constantly proves his cunning or behavioural versatility over his enemy Isengrim the wolf. And I just wanted to make one final point about behavioural flexibility in foxes. The image on the left of the fox playing dead is very common in medieval manuscripts. If you Google it today, it's actually not very common in urban foxes where it's not likely to be an advantage, but it is common in species with less contact like humans, like Arctic foxes. So it may be again that we can think about the medieval period as exhibiting a shift between this mode of catching birds to the easier, because in a rural environment, the geese or ducks are trapped, this easier method of hunting. And then there are cultural contexts too, because foxes were hunted, but they weren't considered a prestigious animal to hunt. So it was much less frequent. My final example, and this is partly in honour of Éric and his book on cats, is the cat. This is a famous poem about an Irish monk sitting writing while his cat hunts mice in his monastery, and the cat is white. The name reveals it, so all your examples of medieval cats are white too. Here I want to think also of plasticity of behaviour in new environments. And like my other examples, this is very speculative. In medieval Europe, cats were common companion animals. They were also killed for their fur and valued as hunters of mice and rats. In a history of the behaviour and adaptation of cats, certainly in the period I look at, it would be interesting to consider the influence of Christian institutions. Pets were popular in medieval monasteries and and nunneries, but regularly banned because they were thought to be a distraction from God and religious duties. The only permitted companions for monks and nuns who loved animals were cats, because their practical value was acknowledged, and therefore, for this reason, it was difficult to ban them. But in fact, when we have sources in monasteries and nunneries from the monks and nuns themselves, they're often about the affectionate relationship with their companion, as well as the cat's success at hunting mice and rats. So I'm going to stop there with my medieval animal examples and my 3 questions. And I will stop sharing.
Super. So that's really, really helpful, really interesting questions and examples. Thank you. Eric, est-ce que vous voulez faire une intervention à ce point? Je vous donne la parole.
Alors, je vais faire des phrases courtes que vous pourrez traduire au fur et à mesure.
Bien sûr, oui, ça marche.
Bon, d'abord, je remercie beaucoup Sophie de sa lecture, hein, extrêmement intéressante. Alors, je ne peux pas, j'aurai pas le temps de répondre sur tout, hein, ou de tout commenter ce qu'elle a fait, et je ne vais regarder que comment dire, je ne vais répondre qu'à quelques aspects. Hein. Je ne sais pas si vous voulez traduire ça.
Yep. So thanks to you very much for your comments and examples. He won't have time to respond to all of the questions you've asked, but he'll focus on some particular aspects.
Alors, d'abord, la première réflexion, je crois elle souligne une voie d'entrée extrêmement importante lorsqu'elle parle des émotions. Hein, et ça, c'est vraiment une manière de relire les textes extrêmement importante et extrêmement fructueuse. Alors, évidemment, il peut y avoir de l'anthropomorphisme, hein, dans cette description des émotions, mais il n'empêche, en ayant derrière soi l'éthologie de l'espèce qu'on étudie, on s'aperçoit que très souvent, la question des émotions permet d'accéder à un vécu, hein, et qu'on n'est pas derrière un écran humain qui empêcherait de voir l'animal.
So I think so. So Eric agrees that the question of emotions that you're raising is extremely important, and thinking about that, thinking about rereading texts and sources in that context is very fruitful and important, and that's it's interesting to think with anthropology in that context, precisely insofar as one might be able to see behind any anthropomorphism actually the actual behaviors of particular animals, that might not necessarily prevent us from seeing particular sorts of observed animal behavior, so that those behaviors may well be discernible through that by thinking carefully with emotions in relation to how sources talk about it on the part of animals.
Oui, il y a notamment, alors Sophie donne des exemples, hein, je suis tout à fait d'accord avec ces exemples. Il y a notamment beaucoup de choses à prendre dans les vies des saints, hein, dans la géographie, les vies des saints, où il y a sans arrêt des animaux, et beaucoup de ces vies permettent de voir l'état des relations humaines entre humains et animaux, et de voir d'aborder le côté animal. C'est pareil pour l'iconographie, hein, pour les images. Sophie en a montré. J'ai travaillé avec des historiens du Moyen-Âge qui ont justement travaillé avec des éthologues sur des images du médiéval et qui ont pu montrer que ça pouvait apporter beaucoup sur le vécu de tel ou tel animal à cette époque-là. Hein, je pense par exemple aux oiseaux, notamment aux oiseaux capturés, aux oiseaux en cage, aux oiseaux à qui on veut apprendre à chanter, etc. Eh bien, les images, notamment les enluminures dans les manuscrits, apportent beaucoup d'informations.
Super. So he absolutely agrees with you in the comments in relation to the usefulness of looking at saints' lives, and many of those lives feature animals and animals very prominently, and human and animal relations, and would agree that it's also the case, but in a different way, with iconography, and that he's worked with medieval art historians and with animal behavioral specialists, looking at what one might derive from medieval iconography of animals, and that one can get to that in certain ways. Particularly interesting the case of birds and captive birds, and the ways in which they're taught to do certain things, singing, for instance. So yeah, absolutely.
Et je crois, comme il est dit, hein, que il faut déjà avoir la volonté de relire les documents, hein, de ne pas en rester à la lecture habituelle. Je donne un autre exemple. Un historien de l'Antiquité travaillant avec moi, hein, et avec un vétérinaire et un éthologue, a étudié les stèles de l'Antiquité grecque, hein, les monuments funéraires de l'Antiquité grecque, les monuments où il y avait représentation d'humains avec leurs chiens. Et l'idée générale jusqu'à présent, c'était que ça ne pouvait rien apporter côté chien, ça ne pouvait apporter que côté humain. Eh bien, en travaillant avec ce vétérinaire et cet éthologue, ce collègue historien de l'Antiquité grecque a pu montrer qu'en fait, les artistes avaient représenté de véritables postures canines. Et des postures canines qui ne s'expliquent, des postures très originales, et qui ne s'expliquent que par le contexte de l'époque, que par la relation entre les maîtres et leurs chiens, entre ces maîtres et leurs chiens, à cette époque-là. Donc, l'artiste a bien capturé quelque chose du vécu de ces chiens.
So he would stress as well the importance of wanting really very actively to reread documents, and not only documents insofar as the an example he would offer would be collaborative work he's done with an ancient historian, a vet, and an animal behavioral specialist, looking at ancient Greek funeral monuments and dogs represented with the dead on those funeral monuments. Whereas before one might have been inclined to disregard or discount the representation of dogs on those. This is an impossibility, and the way in which the dogs are represented is not possible. In fact, collaborating with the vet and the animal behavioral specialist indicated that this was a very particular and contextually very accurate or explicable way in which the dog had been represented with its master on the funeral monument. So something that might have been discounted in a previous context with this sort of interdisciplinary collaboration became not just explicable, but illuminating.
Oui, et je voudrais dire aussi qu'il ne faut pas croire que les documents historiques sont des documents, comment dire, médiocres. Hein. Je prends le cas d'un collègue éthologue qui a travaillé sur les traités d'apprentissage des oiseaux chanteurs au XVIIe, XVIIIe siècle. On pourrait prendre ces traités à la légère en disant au niveau éthologie des oiseaux, ça doit être assez médiocre. Et en fait, ce collègue spécialiste de l'éthologie des oiseaux s'est aperçu que ces traités étaient extrêmement riches. Extrêmement riches. C'est comme les traités de chasse dont a parlé Sophie. Extrêmement riches. Il est même allé jusqu'à dire que finalement, ces gens-là avaient résolu au XVIIe siècle des questions que les éthologues actuels se posaient pendant 10, 20, 30 ans. Et que finalement, au lieu de débattre, ils auraient mieux fait d'aller lire ces traités du XVIIe siècle.
Super. So he would also argue in favor of not discounting sources that one might in previous generations have assumed were sort of low grade or mediocre. And he gives the example of 17th and 18th century treatises on teaching birds to sing, which contemporary specialists, looking at what they say, remark that in the 17th century, the people writing these treatises have resolved all sorts of questions to do with animal behavior or bird behavior that contemporary specialists are still asking themselves. So that one has, as it were, empirically a lot to learn from this material.
Et finalement, pour revenir aussi sur quelque chose que Sophie a dit, ce dialogue entre histoire et éthologie, il va dans les deux sens. Il doit apporter aux deux disciplines. Ce n'est pas simplement l'histoire qui utilise l'éthologie. En fait, le dialogue apporte aux deux. C'est-à-dire que pour les historiens, l'éthologie permet de comprendre telle ou telle situation animale à telle époque, mais pour les éthologues, l'histoire permet de comprendre les changements de comportement d'une espèce. Et donc, les éthologues avec qui j'ai travaillé ont été très intéressés par ce dialogue avec les historiens parce que ça leur a apporté beaucoup, beaucoup dans l'idée d'une plasticité dans le temps qu'ils ont du mal à voir. Et donc, vraiment, c'est un enrichissement mutuel des deux disciplines.
So just as a final point, he would like to stress very much that what should happen, what does happen, the best thing to happen is a proper dialogue between history and animal behavioral specialists. That it's not just a question of historians using ethology. But a question of them both using one another, and that either group gains from this. One gains a history of how animals have behaved, but one also gains an understanding of changes of behavior within a species. So there are insights for both groups in these sorts of collaborations, which provide a sort of mutual enrichment of either discipline and perspective. Super, thank you.
Juste un dernier point, pour pas être trop long, sur les biographies. Sophie pose la question des biographies médiévales. Oui, c'est tout à fait possible. Alors évidemment, il faut avoir les bons documents, mais on peut en faire. Et en mars 2025, j'organise un atelier sur l'histoire équine des chevaux, c'est-à-dire une histoire vraiment des chevaux. Et il y aura 2 médiévistes qui vont faire des biographies de chevaux, donc du Moyen-Âge, du Haut Moyen-Âge et du Moyen-Âge central, c'est tout à fait faisable.
So he'd completely agree that the biographies of animals from really quite distant periods are perfectly possible. That one can write biographies of medieval animals. He's organising a colloque next spring, at which two medievalists, I think, will come to give papers on horses, and will offer biographies of them from sort of high central Middle Ages, so really really some distance away. Just as a final word. Great, thank you, Eric.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone else, for your patience with the Babel fish in the room. Tom, should we pass to you?
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Brilliant. Okay, well, first I'd like to thank Mariam for the invitation. It's really enjoyable to read this paper, and to thank Professor Baratay for a fascinating tour of Western animals to animal species over the longue durée. A few caveats to begin with. I'm a relative newcomer to animal or multi-species history, and mainly I focused on livestock and pests in one particular part of the world, Latin America. So that's going to be portrayed in sort of the comments that I'm going to give below. In general, I found the vision in this paper of a revived historical practice thoroughly compelling. Thinking about animals as actors within history can fill gaps in our ethological, zoological knowledge. It can also, as Professor Baratay argued, reshape our understanding of history, forcing us to reconsider accelerations, ruptures, periods, continuities. So most of my comments and questions concern the first part of the paper. The central argument here is that Western societies have generally given little thought to variations within animal species. And on the one hand, a lot of this argument sounded very recognizable, very reasonable. I was reminded in particular of Marcy Norton's recent work on attitudes to animals in the Spanish conquest of the Americas in the 16th century. The Europeans, according to Norton, did generally think in terms of more or less useful species. Some species were useful as military technology, horses and so on. Some were livestock, cows, pigs, chickens, and some were wild animals to be hunted. So these were the main categories, and they didn't really change over time. Norton shows that for many indigenous groups in the Americas, particularly in lowland tropical regions, they thought differently about animals. Animal species per se was much less important than whether an animal had become a kind of familiarized kin or not. The concept she uses is the aig. So there you've got she makes the case that the crucial importance in these indigenous societies was a category that cross-cut species. On the other hand, I also wondered what this sweeping story in the first half of the paper might have looked like if we had shifted focus away from philosophers and naturalists and zoologists. Now, obviously, these are very important major cultural authorities and influential, but I wondered, what about farmers and ranchers? How did they think about animals? Were they somewhat more attuned? Were they thinking more, perhaps, about change over time than zoologists? What about the people who were tasked with catching rats and mice and other vermin and lived in very close contact with them in some cases? What about elite soldiers and horsemen who gathered in European courts and, as shown recently by Mackenzie Cooley, thought a great deal about the breeding of horses and how to, in her terms, perfect nature or perfect races, that is, breeds of horses? What about colonialists of different stripes from the 16th century onwards who were concerned with acclimatizing creatures so they could be transplanted to other parts of the world? Obviously, that's about space, but it all implies change over time as well. Indeed, as various authors, Norton among them, have argued, domestic animals were not just central to European colonial projects. Ideologies of domestication became very important as well. In fact, arguably, they still are. Domestication here is imagined as a discrete human-initiated event and an accomplishment, something that marks more advanced, i.e. European societies, from less advanced ones. Now, of course, we know much better now. The last 4 decades or so have seen a veritable revolution in our understanding of domestication and when and where and why it happened and how to understand the term. And I think this change is surely connected to some of the important post-1950s innovations in zoology that Professor Baratay discusses. I think there's a broader question here, which is maybe too broad and perhaps unfair, but I'll ask it anyway, and because this is one I've grappled with myself in my teaching about animals and my research. So as we try to identify a sort of dominant culture of human-animal relations in a given context, where should we look? Why should we focus on naturalists and ethologists rather than, say, the practices and the vernacular knowledge of farmers, peasants, rat catchers, empire builders, etc.? Should we focus on prescriptive norms or on practice? Do we need some sort of explicit model for thinking about how certain ideas about animals emerge and become hegemonic, to use an ill-fitting and probably overly sociological term? Should we, in fact, include animals' own agencies and agendas as part of our models of human-animal relations and dominant ideas? And how can we do that? Following on from this, I wondered about some of the connections between ethology and broader cultural and ideological contexts. Briefly, Professor Baratay mentioned some of Charles Georges Leroy's ideas, how they echoed and informed trends in European literature. I'd like to know a little bit more about that, and when and why we see more interplay between naturalists and the broader human culture. It seems to me that the ethological debates of the 1960s and 70s, which the paper touches on at the end, would be another case in point. The historian of science Nadine Weidman has recently argued that the polemic over whether humans were hardwired for aggression, whether they possessed a killer instinct, drove a spate of books, popularized ethology as never before in the United States, but also in Western Europe, and reshaped scientific research agendas, including Jane Goodall's, I believe. So for Weidman, these debates were not reducible to Cold War era disputes over the cooperative or individualistic, educable or unchanging character of human and non-human nature, but neither were they entirely isolated from that underlying ideological context. And many of the participants well understood the political implications and the uses of their work. So I'd be really interested if Professor Baratay believes there's any mileage in this more ideological framing of ethology's recent history. A final question I had was how and whether historians can ever really avoid writing about some non-human animals more than others. As I said, to start, I think the suggestions in this paper for reading across disciplines, reading sources against the grain, and creatively triangulating lots of different documentary sources as we think about animals are very, very welcome and inspiring, in fact. But it would still seem to me that our histories may always skew towards the kinds of animals that most feature in this paper, largely vertebrates and larger mammals. This is because, I think partly because of the intensity of these animals' interactions with people over time, and the documentary traces this tends to lead, yes, but I think it also may have to do with our capacity, learned through history, to identify and empathize with some creatures more than others. Now, I spent a bit of background for this comment. I've spent a lot of the last year and a half thinking about insects, and particularly insect pests. So there's no shortage of human discourse about these kinds of creatures, although not within sort of mainstream zoology. There's much more specialized subfields of entomology and, in fact, economic entomology by the 20th century. Now, this isn't that surprising. Insects could be very powerful allies or, more often, enemies. Think of McNeill's mosquito empires, which repelled European conquest for centuries. The specific insect I've been researching more recently is a kind of blowfly whose larvae eat the living flesh of warm-blooded mammals, usually cattle, deer, but sometimes people as well. So these were creatures which US entomologists attempted to breed and sterilize en masse with radiation beginning in the late 1940s. This was a kind of atomic insect eugenics and a precursor to today's genetically modified mosquitoes, which we can find in lots of places, particularly Brazil. So insects may have become increasingly manipulable through the 19th and 20th century, but they're still usually seen as profoundly strange and alien beings, few of whose behaviors, reproductive habits, life cycles, or learnings seem remotely similar to humans, sometimes horrifyingly so. There's lots of literary and Hollywood echoes here that are so obvious I'm not going to go into them. So I suppose one thing I might add to conclude to Professor Baratay's wise call to empathize with animals' experiences is that we probably also need to think critically about the meaning and the history of empathy itself and our relationship with animals, which generally alienate or even disgust us, and whose individual study seems fraught with difficulty, if not impossible, and somehow do our best to bring those into history as well. Thank you very much.
Super, thanks, Tom. Those really interesting comments and questions. For some reason, I don't know, maybe it's slightly the French context in which we're obviously speaking. That there's an Asterix book that comes to mind. Is it Asterix and the Double Agent? Is that the name of that Asterix volume? But there's a mosquito in it who's the sort of go-between of the double agent who brings him news and is sort of in love with the double agent. Just as an interesting case of an insect with some sort of personality or imagined personality in a.
I'll have to defer to you on that one, John. We're a Tintin household at the moment. So.
Okay, all right. Super. Éric, je vous donne la parole.
Thank you very much, Tom. Merci beaucoup. Alors, je vais répondre. J'ai trois points. Premier point, sur les sources et notamment sur les producteurs des sources, ne pas en rester aux élites, aux savants, aux naturalistes, etc. Oui, effectivement, il faut varier les sources et c'est tout à fait possible. C'est tout à fait possible. On peut, par exemple, côté paysan, il y a à partir du XIXe siècle, il y a des journaux de paysans et l'on peut trouver des choses extrêmement intéressantes sur le vécu avec les animaux et donc, en retournant les choses, voir ce qui se passe du côté de ces animaux. Il y a aussi, par exemple, tout ce qui est photographie. Les photographies permettent de voir ce qui se passe dans le monde populaire ou dans le monde bourgeois, dans les villes du XIXe siècle ou du XXe siècle, par exemple avec les chevaux. On trouve plein d'indications intéressantes. Donc effectivement, il faut varier les sources et d'ailleurs dans le livre que j'ai écrit sur les chats, ce ne sont pas des naturalistes qui sont à la base de mes sources, ce sont des écrivains, des témoignages de gens qui n'ont pas l'autorité scientifique et qui ont leur propre témoignage.
Super. So yes, he'd absolutely agree on the need to vary the sources that one looks at, and would cite by way of illustration peasant newspapers or newspapers targeted at a peasant readership in the 19th century, where you have where you'll have many articles or commentaries on the lived experience of peasants with animals, or thinking about that. Photography would be another interesting case. Obviously, there's only so far one can go with that chronologically, but certainly 19th century photography is very helpful and illuminating in that respect. And this was something he's done in his book on cats, which doesn't privilege writers or sources with a particular sort of scientific authority, but looks as well at writers of different sorts and people without any sort of scientific authority too.
Oui, pour compléter, il y a un exemple qui est un exemple concret qui est qui est très intéressant, c'est celui de la Première Guerre mondiale, hein, où on a quantité de témoignages de soldats, de combattants, anglais, allemands, français. Et dans ces témoignages, on trouve beaucoup de choses sur les animaux. Et ces gens-là peuvent être des ouvriers, des artisans, des bourgeois, des instituteurs. Et donc, les témoignages sont de milieux sociaux très variés. Et on y trouve beaucoup d'indications sur les animaux. Donc, effectivement, voilà un exemple où on a besoin de... Il est nécessaire, il est obligatoire de diversifier les sources.
Yeah. So studies around First World War would be very interesting in this respect as well, where you have lots and lots of testimonies from soldiers, by definition, coming from very mixed social backgrounds, but which provide lots and lots of testimony about human-animal relations and animal lives in those contexts. So you'd absolutely agree one needs to diversify source base in that respect.
Deuxième point, c'est le lien, enfin la question de l'éthologie, hein, et notamment l'inscription de l'éthologie dans l'histoire. Alors évidemment, il faut prendre du recul avec l'éthologie. Hein. L'éthologie a une histoire, elle a beaucoup varié depuis le XIXe siècle. Il y a des écoles éthologiques qui se sont succédées ou qui se sont combattues. Et il faut savoir cela et il faut prendre du recul. Alors évidemment, par exemple, les deux grandes écoles éthologiques du XXe siècle étaient des écoles très réductionnistes qui accordaient très peu de choses aux animaux. Par contre, depuis les années 1970-80, c'est l'éthologie cognitive qui l'a emporté, et c'est une éthologie maintenant que pratiquent tous les éthologues et qui permet d'accorder et d'accepter que les animaux aient des capacités, et on les découvre année après année. Hein, donc effectivement, il faut prendre du recul avec l'éthologie, il faut choisir, je dirais, l'éthologie intéressante. Et alors, pourquoi cette éthologie très réductionniste du XXe siècle? Moi, personnellement, je la mets en relation avec cette volonté entre les années 1920 et 1970-80, cette volonté accrue, plus accrue qu'avant, de maîtriser, d'exploiter la nature. Et qu'on voit par exemple avec le développement de l'élevage industriel et de l'abattage industriel. Finalement, l'éthologie accompagne ce phénomène.
Super. So, yeah, the point of the question in relation to animal behavior and the sort of ideology that might be inscribed within its paradigms, one absolutely needs to take a step back from particular modes or styles, traditions of animal behavior, ethology, and evaluate them on their own terms. So he draw a contrast between older, more reductionist styles of that in the 19th and 20th centuries, in particular, where there was a desire to exploit nature for human ends, and a desire which ethologists accompanied step by step, we're in train with much more recent developments since the 70s, which is where ethologists have a much greater commitment to and recognition of animal capacities and capabilities, to the point that each year one's discerning new capabilities in that respect because of a much more open-minded model.
Troisième point, c'est sur les animaux. Évidemment, je partage l'avis de Tom et que Sophie aussi a évoqué. Évidemment, utiliser des documents humains pour aller voir ce qui se passe du côté des animaux nous conduit à étudier certains animaux. Les animaux les plus proches des humains, ceux pour lesquels ils ont le plus écrit. Et ce sont évidemment surtout les animaux domestiqués, les chiens, les chevaux. On est tout à fait d'accord. Là, nous sommes dépendants des sources. Mais il ne faut pas désespérer. Il y a deux choses importantes. Un, je crois qu'on apprend petit à petit à aller voir les autres espèces. Et Tom a parlé des insectes. Eh bien, je crois que on va se mettre à ça du côté des insectes. Et notamment, il y a un collègue historien de l'Antiquité grecque qui nous a fait un travail il y a 2 ans sur les abeilles de Crète et sur le comportement des abeilles de l'île de Crète de l'Antiquité jusqu'à nos jours. Et il a fait un texte extrêmement intéressant en travaillant avec des éthologues, etc. Un texte extrêmement intéressant où il nous a montré à quel point les abeilles de Crète avaient un comportement particulier et comment on pouvait l'expliquer, comment il s'est maintenu. Et puis, il y a une deuxième manière de ne pas désespérer, au contraire de penser que petit à petit, on va élargir, c'est le recours à la génétique. La génétique va être, pour moi, la génétique va être la grande source du XXIe siècle. Pas simplement pour les animaux, mais aussi pour les humains, parce qu'elle nous donne des informations que nous n'avons pas dans les documents habituels. Les généticiens sont capables maintenant de nous parler d'alimentation, de maladies, de changement de comportement, de changement de région. Ils sont capables de nous dire que l'humain ou l'animal a changé de région durant sa vie. Donc, plein de choses pour lesquelles nous n'avions aucun document. Et avec cette génétique, on va pouvoir aller voir non seulement les animaux domestiques moins prisés comme le cheval ou le chien, mais aller voir aussi les animaux sauvages. Et là, ça va être une révolution très, très importante. Et il faut que les historiens se mettent à travailler avec les généticiens. Alors, c'est difficile. J'ai organisé il y a 2 ans, en 2022, une journée d'études génétique et histoire à Paris. Il y avait plus d'intervenants que d'assistants. Donc, ça a été l'échec. Mais je pense que bon, c'est l'avenir et il faut s'y mettre.
Okay. So on the question of animals and on the tendency to see only particular sorts of animals, he'd quite agree that Eric would quite agree that we're dependent for the most part on human sources, which do have a tendency to deal with the particular sorts of charismatic animals. That's my term, not either of yours. That we've tended to see feature in everyone's kind of comments today. But Eric would suggest there are 2 good reasons why one shouldn't despair. Firstly, that step by step we're starting to see new species, that the attention and the thoughtfulness about trying to think precisely about the question you raised, Tom, is actually opening out our ability to notice them in different ways. And he'd offer the example of a particular ancient Greek historian who has worked on Cretan bees from Crete, and their particular behavioural patterns. A work, I think, which goes from antiquity to the present, if I understood correctly. The second reason not to despair he would offer is would be the recourse that that historians are increasingly having to genetics, which Eric would see as the great source of the 21st century that provides us with information that we lack in traditional sources, and at levels of analysis that one lacks from traditional sources. One can tell from that changes in movement, that animals have changed where they dwell. One can see changes in diet, changes in health, and that those sorts of analyses also allow one in a different way to move from just writing the histories of the usual suspect animals of dogs or horses, and go into different sorts of questions. Bon, merci Eric, c'était fructueux cette discussion et votre réponse. Nous avons un petit peu de temps. We have a little bit of time, 15 minutes, 15 minutes or so, for more general questions. I can see two in the chat. Let me try and translate those. So Issy has a question in particular about Eduardo de Vizier de Castro's idea of l'idée d'équivocation qu'elle suggère est invalable ici, on va utiliser le terme des mots de Vincent de Près, que peut-être nous parlons ici de la biographie des animaux comme une version en prose. Je ne comprends pas moi-même le sens de la distinction là, mais que c'est peut-être que nous proposons les biographies qui offrent les défis pour notre concept des animaux en particulier, que à mettre les animaux dans les concepts a priori que nous avons. Est-ce que c'est un petit peu clair au moins?
Oui. Bien sûr, hein, évidemment. J'allais dire, nous ne sommes que des humains. Hein. Donc, nous abordons les animaux avec nos manières de voir. Nous ne pouvons pas faire autrement. Alors, par contre, ce que nous pouvons faire, c'est petit à petit se détacher de nos manières de voir et tendre vers ces animaux. Ça n'est pas facile. Et donc, mais là aussi, je crois qu'il faut faire confiance en l'avenir. Hein. C'est-à-dire que il y a 20 ans, nous n'étions pas capables. Personnellement, je n'étais pas capable de voir comment faire une histoire du côté des animaux. Et puis j'ai vu comment on pouvait faire. Et c'est une histoire qui reste imparfaite, hein, évidemment, qui reste partielle, qui reste imparfaite et qui est à améliorer. Et l'idée effectivement d'essayer de sortir de nos concepts, de nos schémas, est effectivement très important. Hein. Alors, j'ai publié un volume collectif il y a 2 ans sur les concepts, où justement, on essayait de désanthropiser les concepts pour pouvoir interroger les animaux. Hein. Par exemple, sortir le concept de langage, le concept de dessin, de leur version humaine, pour aboutir à une version beaucoup plus large, beaucoup plus apte aux animaux. Hein, donc, effectivement, mais ça, je dirais que c'est du travail en cours et à venir. Hein, c'est un appel aux jeunes chercheurs, justement. Hein, c'est eux qui feront ça.
So Eric would entirely agree with you. He would say we are humans. We see in the particular ways that we do as our sort of default sets of points of departure. But the challenge is to detach ourselves from those and to see animals as animals on their own account, in their own rights. and that step by step we are making progress in that respect. He'd suggest that we should have confidence in the future in that regard. That 20 years ago he wouldn't have thought himself capable of being able to write a history of animals, but that that clearly the basis of the conversation today, that is increasingly possible. He'd draw attention to the need to work very actively on this as well. So there's an edited volume that he's worked on, which was an attempt to de-anthropomorphize our concepts in relation to how we might think about animals. So how would you de-anthropomorphize language? How would you de-anthropomorphize design to make it more apt, more suitable, for animals, and in that respect. So yes, I hope that answers your question. I think that might be, is that Andrew behind Fullbrook's Pro? I think it might be. Donc, il y a une relation claire entre l'histoire et l'éthologie et la génétique, quand on voit en deux sens entre les deux, un dialogue et un enrichissement dans ce sens. Est-ce que la proposition, ça offre un modèle pour penser la relation entre l'histoire et les sciences naturelles du corps, pensez-vous? Est-ce que les relations spécifiques que vous avez analysées aujourd'hui entre l'histoire et l'éthologie, ça offre un modèle plus applicable aux relations entre l'histoire et les sciences naturelles du corps?
Oui, tout à fait. Alors, effectivement, il y a là une difficulté. Les historiens, mais aussi les gens des sciences humaines, n'ont pas l'habitude de travailler avec les sciences de la vie. Et inversement, les gens des sciences de la vie n'ont pas l'habitude de travailler avec nous. Donc, il y a un apprentissage réciproque. Mais justement, oui, ce qu'on a voulu faire pendant 5 ans, j'ai fait des rencontres entre gens des sciences humaines et gens des sciences de la vie, et ces gens-là ont appris à travailler ensemble. Alors ça suppose comment dire, une grande ouverture d'esprit. Ça suppose aussi de ne pas croire que sa discipline est plus importante que l'autre. Ça suppose d'accepter de remettre en cause ses certitudes. Alors évidemment, ça n'est pas facile. Il y a beaucoup de collègues historiens ou beaucoup de collègues des sciences de la vie qui préfèrent rester dans leur discipline et pas se lancer dans ce dialogue, parce qu'il n'est pas facile. Mais lorsque on est dedans, lorsqu'on prend l'habitude, je l'ai vu pour moi et puis je vois pour les gens avec qui j'ai travaillé, eh bien c'est un enrichissement extrêmement important.
Yeah, so he would absolutely agree that it does, Eric thinks, provide a more generally applicable model, or certainly a more generally applicable mode of engagement between natural scientists and social human scientists or humanities scholars more generally, that it can provide a kind of great opening for those who want to embark on such a kind of journey, which he would see very much, which Eric would see very much as a sort of mutual interrogation for such conversations to work. One must assume that one discipline is not more important than the other, that one discipline does not have the answers that another discipline should subordinate itself to, and that in order to do so, one has to put into question one's own certainties about one's own paradigm. There are plenty of people who are happy not to do that and to remain in their zone. But if one does do that, it can be extremely fruitful and mutually enriching. Something I should have said, I didn't translate earlier, that Eric said just in relation to Ellie's question, is that in particular he'd suggest that this is a field that is very welcoming and very supportive for younger scholars. That this is in particular a young person sort of field, but precisely because it's very orientated towards the future and to discoveries and the discoveries and insights that are being generated on a year by year basis. Super. We only have a few more minutes left. If there are no other questions, Marianne had a very interesting question, which I'd like to put to you, Eric. Just for the English speaker, sorry, I should have realised I should have been reading out the English questions in the chat, just for the record. I failed to do that. Never mind. But Mariam's question is really about the status of the species as a category. Je vais traduire ce que je vais dire en français dans un instant, Eric. So Mariam's question is about the status of species as a category. So a lot of what Eric is doing is thinking about animal individuality inside a category of species, and suggesting you have much more plurality by way of individuals within a species. Mariam's question is whether that challenges in any way or puts into question the category of species itself. Donc, la question de Mariam est sur le statut de l'espèce comme catégorie elle-même. Si on peut, pensons des animaux individus, si on parle de ça, on dit que les animaux, ils sont variables. Est-ce que cette question, est-ce qu'ils remettent en question la stabilité de l'espèce comme catégorie du corps? Est-ce qu'on peut repenser la catégorie de l'espèce comme catégorie?
Oui, alors, il y a deux manières de répondre, hein. La première manière, les éthologues actuels considèrent que le bon niveau d'étude, ce n'est plus l'espèce, c'est l'individu, hein, parce que c'est là qu'on voit les capacités à l'œuvre. Alors, ça ne veut pas dire que l'espèce n'existe plus, mais on sort d'une éthologie qui pensait, notamment par exemple l'éthologie de Karl Lorenz, qui pensait qu'on pouvait définir l'espèce par le comportement. Et donc, les individus ne comptaient pas finalement parce qu'ils avaient tous le même comportement dans l'espace et dans le temps. Or, on sait maintenant que ce n'est pas vrai. Les individus n'ont pas tous le même comportement. On peut même parler, il y a des éthologues maintenant qui étudient ce qu'on appelle les folies animales. Donc, l'espèce existe toujours. Il y a un cadre biologique qui définit l'espèce, Mais à l'intérieur de ce cadre biologique, il y a beaucoup de souplesse, de plasticité. Et puis, alors, deuxième réponse, il est vrai qu'actuellement, on remet en cause non pas la notion d'espèce, mais comment dire, je suis en train de perdre le nom, le côté clos, le côté fermé de l'espèce. Hein. On se rend compte que l'hybridation entre espèces est quelque chose de très répandu maintenant dans la nature. C'est quelque chose qu'on est en train de découvrir. Hein. Et donc, l'espèce n'est pas une entité étanche.
Super. So, Eric would suggest that many ethologists, many animal behavioral specialists think that the right level at which to think about animals is not at the level of the species, but at the level of the individual. That's not to say that species doesn't exist as a biological category. He'd point to the work of Karl Lorenz, who suggested that one could define species by behavior, that species is constituted by the same behavior in time and space, and that's what one should read off one should read off species in relation to that. That's an approach that has been criticized and rejected. So that it's not that species doesn't exist as a biological category, but that within the category of species there is a great deal of plasticity and movement, so that one should not be too rigid in thinking about that in and of itself as a category. In particular, he would stress the importance of thinking about hybridity and thinking about crossbreeding. There's one side of thinking about species as a category that would stress its sort of closed nature, that the sort of impermeable membrane that closes species off from one another. But as we know, questions of hybridity and cross-fertilization across so-called species indicate that in fact that is a very again, this is my metaphor, not his, indicate that is a very permeable membrane, not an impermeable membrane, and that again one should be thinking perhaps more in a more open-ended way about the category of species and not become too imprisoned in it. Again, that's a slightly freer version of Eric's response than what he said, but I hope it captures the spirit of it. We've run a little bit over, but we should I think probably draw to a close now, in particular since it's an hour closer to Eric's dinner time than it is to anyone in the UK. It just remains for me really to thank Eric enormously, both for his work, but also for the generosity of his responses to Sophie and Tom, and to obviously in turn thank Sophie and Tom for the thoughtfulness of their comments and the interest on their own accounts of what it is they have to say. And then finally, obviously, of course, both to thank Zoe Paskett for organising all of this, but also to thank Mariam, whose brainchild it is absolutely. So thank you all very much. Eric, Mariam, I don't know if you like to add anything just before we close.
I don't have anything to add to those very good words.
Okay, all right.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you all so much. Do come along for the next one. I don't have the next one in my head, Mariam.
Sue Donaldson and Will Kimlicker on the, I think, 19th of June.
Super.
But do check that. Do check that.
Yes, so the link I put earlier on in the chat will take you to all of the further events. So
Yeah.
thank you all
And
so
also,
very much.
sorry, can I just
Sorry.
add to that we also have Eva Mayer and Alistair Cochrane responding.
Super. Thank you so much, Eric. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you, John, Sophie, Tom, et Marianne. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you all. Take care.
Au revoir.
I think these are the people who are not their computers and don't know that we've finished. Should we turn the recording off? You're muted. You're muted. You're muted. I can't hear you.
Is it still recording? I don't know how to pause, stop recording. Okay, yeah.